Hi there, students. Welcome back. And we're going to get into Chapter 3, Part 2. This is Part 2 of Creating Anglo America. We are talking about the time period between 1660 and 1750, all the time period leading up to the American Revolution. And here you have your list of key terms. So today we are going to be talking about the colonies, of course, but we are going to begin with talking about the New England colonies and some of the political transformations that are going to happen as a result of King Philip's War and other things that are happening in England. And then we're going to talk about the Salem witch trials. I did post a video on the Salem witch trials for you to review and look at to give you a broader understanding. You will also be doing a response to the Salem witch trials. And then finally, we're going to be talking about population growth generally, and we're going to be looking at some different demographic changes that are taking place in the colonies as we get into the 18th century. So we're going to begin by talking about two things that were going to start to anger the colonists when it comes to English rule. The first is the Lords of Trade, and the second is the Dominion of New England. So I'll begin with the Lords of Trade. In 1675, the English government decides to establish something called the Lords of Trade. This is a group, group of commissioners, if you will, that oversee trade in the North American colonies. Now, the Lords of Trade were created in response to primarily the Northeast, so the New England colonies' refusal to follow the Navigation Acts. So if you remember, the Navigation Acts were those acts that were passed by England in an effort to try to control the trade that was coming in and out of the colonies. Because remember, when you're talking about an economic system called mercantilism, you want to ensure that all of those riches are circulating back to the mother country. And as I mentioned in the previous lecture, the reason why that didn't always happen is because New England had very close proximity to other colonial powers like France, for example, but also the Dutch and also the Spanish. And so there was a lot of temptation to engage in trade, illegal trade, and also smuggling, bringing in illegal goods as well. So the English government, kind of catches on to this, and they decide to establish the Lords of Trade. So we're going to begin to see this is really sort of planting the seeds, as the Navigation Acts also were, planting the seeds of resentment when it comes to British control over these colonies. The second thing that happens is a brief period of time. It's a 3-year period of time between 1686 and 1689, where the British government decides to create something called the Dominion of New England. And they put this guy in charge, Sir Edmund Andros, and he gets put in charge of this very large territory that included Connecticut, Plymouth, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, New York, and parts of Northeast New Jersey. So there's this gigantic, piece of land he's put in charge of. And the Dominion is very much modeled on the Spanish viceroy system, where essentially you have one person that's in charge of a very large piece of the colonies, and they have full and complete control. Now, he did not have to answer, Andros did not have to answer to an elected assembly. And keep in mind that these colonists were very much accustomed to having these elected assemblies and having those assemblies be accountable to the voters. And so Andros comes along and he pisses a bunch of people in New England off by doing things like appointing friends. He imposes some taxes. He declares certain land grants null and void. He enforces religious toleration, God forbid, especially in those Puritan communities where there really was no religious toleration, right? And I talked about that when I talked about the Puritans. The Puritans came to the British North American colonies not to create this sort of big, free loving, religious, diverse society. They came to the North American colonies in order to create their own insulated, pure, godly societies. And so when the Dominion of New England is created, and these various religious toleration acts are being passed by the British Parliament, particularly after the Glorious Revolution, which we're going to talk about in a minute. This religious toleration is going to transfer over to the colonies, and this is going to create a lot of anger. So, because of all of this, this Dominion of New England lasts just a very short period of time, these 3 years between 1686 and 1689. And eventually, Andros is going to be forcefully deposed by the people because he has created this, sort of tyrannical government in these colonies that are very much used to having self government. Okay, so now we're going to turn to talking about the Glorious Revolution and the English Bill of Rights. So, the Glorious Revolution was the forced overthrow, the forced coup, essentially, of King James II. And the reason why he was overthrown is his wife had given birth to a potential Catholic heir to the British throne. And there had been religious conflict in England for quite some time between the Protestants and the Catholics. And remember when I talked about religion in Europe, one of the things that really comes out of the Protestant Reformation is this idea that the people have to follow the religion of their leader. And so, because there were so many Protestants in England, including the Anglicans who considered themselves Protestant, they were very fearful that there would be a Catholic monarch that would take over the country. So in 1688, there's this big coup that's staged, and it's called the Glorious Revolution because it is a bloodless coup. Nobody dies, there's no wars or anything that happens. Essentially, what it leads to is the exile of King James II. And what the English parliamentarians do is they invite some new monarchs to come and sit on the British throne. And they invite Dutch William of Orange and his wife, who was the sister to King James II, to come and sit on the British throne. So, when I say parliamentarians, I'm talking about the people in England that believe that the British Parliament should have the primary political power, right? Keep in mind that this is a period of not just religious, but also political transition in England. So you're having this Protestant takeover of England, right? And that began with King Henry VIII and the fact that he wanted to get a divorce, and then he founds the Church of England. And then in response to that, you get Puritans and all these other groups that kind of splinter off of the Anglican Church. They're all Protestant. But at the same time, there's still people in England that remain loyal to the Catholic Church. Then there are two political sides. There are the royalists who believe that the monarchs should have absolute authority, and there are the parliamentarians that believe that the legislative body should have um, political authority, right? So the British Parliament is very similar to our United States Congress, okay? The British Parliament has two houses. It has the House of Lords and the House of Commons, which is very similar to our Senate and our congressional house, the U.S. Congress. And um, so this is, what's happening in England, but it's happening, almost a century before it happens here, is this political sort of, dispute. Who's going to have power? Is it going to be the king, or is it going to be the parliament and the lawmakers? In this particular case, the parliamentarians are going to win. The Glorious Revolution will lead to the ascent of the Parliament as being the primary political power in England from 1688 moving forward. When King William of Orange and Queen Mary come to take the throne, they agree to allow the Parliament to have this power. Okay, and when this happens, the Parliament passes the English Bill of Rights. And this happens in 1689. And what this does is, this is, like I said, representative of this political transition in England. What it does is it lists the power of Parliament. It gives the Parliament a lot more political power when it comes to lawmaking, when it comes to being the final authority on laws in England. And then it also lists rights of individuals. So it does emphasize this idea of individual rights and liberties. It also talks about, reinforces common law, so like the right to trial by jury and that type of thing, which already existed in English law, but it reemphasizes that. It also talks about land distribution for individuals, which again, in the minds of English, in the minds of the colonists, that equals freedom equals land, right? And it also emphasizes Protestantism, right? So it is a very sort of anti-Catholic movement, but it also is sort of a democratic movement in that it is ending this monarchical absolute rule that had existed in England up to that point. So let's talk about how the Glorious Revolution is going to impact the American colonies, right? Because after all, this is an American history class, so we're going to focus on how it's impacting us, right? So in 1688, when King James II is overthrown by this, this bloodless coup, this will lead to a series of uprisings in the colonies that will lead to Andros, the guy that was in charge of the Dominion of New England. It will lead to his disposal. So he will basically be forced to step down. And when this happens, Massachusetts is restored as its original charter, but it's a very short-lived time period. What ends up happening is that the royal government, this new parliamentary royal government, is going to step in and take control of these colonies. And Massachusetts will become a royal colony, and it will be joined with the Plymouth colony. So remember, way back at the beginning of the 1600s, if you look at the map here, the Massachusetts Bay Colony and the Plymouth Colony were two separate colonies. Once this becomes a royal colony, these two colonies will be joined together. And significantly for the Puritan population is the voting requirements in this colony is going to change, because now that it is a royal colony, the colonists no longer can have control over who can vote. And so the parliament is coming in and is saying, you cannot require that people are members of the church. Remember the church membership and the visible saints and all of that, and you have to own land and all of that. You must now, allow people who are any male of voting age within this colony. You need to allow them to vote, and the colony must abide by this new act of parliament called the English Toleration Act. The English Toleration Act is passed by the British Parliament in 1690, and basically what it does is it allows all Protestants to worship freely. So this is going to be a major upset for these Puritan colonists who really wanted to, like I said, keep their insular religious communities. They wanted to reject any other type of religion. They wanted to ostracize, they wanted to make laws that discriminated against other religions, the English Toleration Act of the British Parliament that was passed in 1690 does not allow them to do that anymore. So what you're seeing happening in especially Massachusetts during this time period is that the whole political and religious structure that was really built up during the time of the early colonies, during the time of the early Puritans, is going to start to fall apart. And this on top of the already existing religious anxiety in the colonies is really going to lead to a lot of very sort of strange events in these colonies. And of course, the most famous of these strange events are the Salem witch trials. Okay, so now we're going to talk about this very notorious event in colonial history, the Salem witch trials. The Salem witch trials take place from February of 1692 until May of 1693. Now, before I talk about the actual events that led up to the Salem witch trial and the trial themselves, I want to kind of talk just about witchcraft generally. So this idea of witchcraft and devil possession and those types of things, this was not uncommon. This was something that these colonists had really inherited from Europe. Um, Witch trials had been happening in Europe for centuries before this. But what's interesting is that in colonial America, the majority of the accusations of witchcraft come from the New England colonies. And I think it's very much tied to um, the Puritan belief system, right? So it's no surprise then that these witch trials do take place in New England, and they take place in the town of Salem. And so let's talk about what the colonists thought a witch was, what they believed a witch was. So a witch is somebody who entered in with a pack with the devil. They had made some kind of a deal with the devil. And they did this in order to obtain supernatural powers. And those supernatural powers were used either to harm other people or to help that person, but they were used for typically nefarious reasons, right? They weren't used for good. And the majority of people who were accused of doing this were women. And the reason for that, the rationale that was given at the time, was that women were more irrational, women were more sex prone to sexual desire, that women were just weaker constitutionally, and so that the devil would take advantage of women, right? So it was always like typically it was women that were accused of this. That's not always true. Men could also be accused of witchcraft, as we're going to see in the Salem witch trials. In fact, 6 of the people that were killed during the Salem witch trials were men. Um, but and also another thing about witchcraft is that it typically these accusations of witchcraft would often accompany some other type of event that was happening in the community. So maybe there was a disease that was going around, or maybe there was a bad crop, right? Or maybe, a bunch of, uh, horses or cattle are ending up dead. So something bad is happening in the community, and people are looking for a reason why these types of things are happening. And so this was like an easy way to understand these misfortunes and the world around them. Is by, this idea that the devil is sort of working through these people in order to make bad things happen. So let's talk a little bit about the Salem witch trials specifically. So the Salem witch trials actually began with a group of girls who started having these what appeared to be like spasms. And they appeared to be, possessed or something. And they would have them sometimes in unison. It appeared that they were hallucinating, that they were talking to spirits that weren't there, etc. And when they were pressed on why they were having these experiences, they said that they had basically been enchanted by their maid, this West Indian woman, Caribbean woman by the name of Tituba. And so she was essentially a slave, and we think that she was probably from Barbados, which is where it was an English colony. It was where a lot of these slaves came from. And so the girls blamed Tituba for basically possessing them. And, this sets off a whole series of events. And pretty soon, it's not just the girls that are accusing people of Tituba of this witchcraft. It's, other people, other even women that were accusing other women of it. And ultimately, about 100 plus people, mostly women, are accused of this witchcraft. Now, for each person that was accused, they actually had to be tried, right? Because it was a crime to be a witch. So, the interesting thing about the Salem witch trials is that if you were accused of being a witch, you were more likely to be executed if you denied it. So, for example, the first person to be accused of being a witch was Tituba. And Tituba said, okay, fine, I'm a witch. And then she said, but I got enchanted, I got possessed by so and so, right? And so she's kind of passing the buck, and she is revealing these things. Tituba talked a lot about like the various details of what the devil had told her to do, and describe the devil. And here are these people who are furiously writing down all of these details of what Tituba is telling them. And so Tituba actually evades execution because she admits to it. But of these 100 plus people that are accused, 20 refuse to admit that they are indeed possessed. And so those 20 people will be killed. When the end comes, 14 women and 6 men are killed because they are considered witches. Now, the way in which these trials worked was very strange by today's standard. The way that they essentially worked was that you would have a jury, you would have a judge, but you would have witnesses come in, and those witnesses were allowed to give something called specter evidence. And specter evidence is something that is no longer allowed in a court of law. But essentially, what it was is you could say that you were hearing things, seeing things from spirits, and that could be admitted as actual evidence to a crime. So this caused all kinds of problems because you had these witnesses that were coming in and they were saying, hold on a second. And then they would say that they saw some kind of spirit enter the courtroom, and then they would describe that spirit, and then they would relay the information that that spirit was saying. And so, again, this was a very sort of bizarre fiasco, right? Because you're having this whole, courtroom drama, and it lasted for over a year. So, why did the Salem witch trials happen? Well, we can really point to a number of things that historians believe were happening at the time. The first thing, and this was an ongoing thing at the Salem, in Salem and in Massachusetts at this time period, was religious anxiety, right? This idea of predestination, this idea of whether or not your soul was going to be saved. You also had the switching over from the Dominion of New England, right, under Andros, and then the brief period of time in which the Massachusetts Charter was restored, and then Massachusetts becomes a royal colony. And so, as a result of that, there's this changing political climate, and the church is losing power. The church is losing power, and the tax system is changing. So, it used to be in the New England tax system that part of the taxes that people paid actually went to pay the salaries of the ministers because the church was so important in that community. Those laws change after it becomes a royal colony. You're also going to see an influx of newcomers into these towns during this time period. And these newcomers are focused more on making money than they are on maintaining this godly society. You also have, of course, the Native Americans and the fact that King Philip's War has fairly recently taken place. People are having anxiety about Native American attacks. There is no longer any kind of peaceful relations between the colonists in this region and the Native Americans. It is pretty much hostile relationships. And then you have these strained resources. It turns out that the winter of 1692 was an extremely cold, cold winter. And so the food was scarce. People were having a hard time making ends meet. And so the sermons in the churches were becoming very dark, and people were very much afraid that there were evil forces afoot, right? So, for all of these reasons, the Salem witch trials happen. Now, why do they end? Well, one of the reasons why they ended was because it got so intense in the Salem town that the preachers, the ministers, wives and daughters were starting to be accused of witchcraft. And this is where a man by the name of Cotton Mather, a very influential minister in Salem, his wife gets accused of witchcraft, and he declares immediately that this specter evidence is no longer going to be allowed in the courtroom. So I think because there were so many accusations and the accusations started spreading into families of influence that eventually they will put an end to it. So it really turns out that the Salem witch trials are this sort of cautionary tale, this strange anomaly in American history. Of course, there were other accusations of witchcraft throughout the colonial era, but nothing on this scale and nothing that really reaches the point of this type of hysteria. So here you have a map, and I'm just going to point something out on this map. So this was a map that was made by historians who studied this event in colonial history, and they wanted to know what were the locations, what were the residents of the people who were being accused of witchcraft and the people who were the accusers. And when they mapped this out, they found something really interesting, really interesting. And you'll notice here that all the triangles are representative of the people who were being accused of witchcraft. And then the accusers are the people who are all represented here in these squares. Well, it turns out that these two groups of people were actually different waves of colonists. So the accusers tended to be more of the old colonists, definitely more rural areas out here along the frontier, which would have given them more anxiety, especially when it came to Native Americans. And they tended to be more religious. The people who were being accused were the people who were closer to the town. They tended to be more of the merchant class. They tended to be the newer families to the particular colony. So it's interesting to think about that as well and to look at that because that could have a lot to do with what was causing this anxiety, right? These newcomers to Salem town. All right, so here you have an artist rendering image of poor Corey Giles, or Giles Corey. He was the husband of Martha Corey, and he was one of the 20 people who was accused and executed for witchcraft. 19 of the 20 were hung. Um, uh, Giles Corey was the only one that was actually crushed to death by stone. And so he had a particularly gruesome fate. And you can see here what they're doing is they have this plank of wood and they are adding more and more stones to it. And his last words were more weight because he refused to say that he was a witch. So I'm going to talk now kind of generally about the colonies. We're going to move away from the New England colonies now and talk more generally about 18th century colonies. And what one of the big things that happens in the 18th century, and remember when I say 18th century, I'm talking about the 1700s. As we get into that, we start to see growth in the colonies. A lot of this growth is due to immigrants coming in. A lot of it is due to natural growth as well. As more people come to the colonies, those coastal settlements that we have been talking about are going to become overpopulated, and people are going to start to move westward into the frontier regions for opportunities to own land. One of the interesting things that begins to happen is that as the religious and political problems in England start to settle down as we get into the 18th century, you start to see less and less people immigrating to the British North American colonies from England. What happens is in 1740, in order to keep the population of the British North American colonies up, the Parliament passes an immigration law that offers British or English citizenship to any immigrant that comes to the British North American colonies after 7 years. So all they had to do, if you came from any other parts of Europe and settled in these British North American colonies, was live there for 7 years and automatically you would become a citizen. So the result of this is that you are going to start to see um, more people from different parts of Europe, not from England, coming to British North America. So Scottish people, the Scotch Irish people, the Germans are going to start to arrive in large numbers. They had their own sets of indentured servants that came over, and the German indentures were called the redemptioners. And they came over in large numbers in the 18th century. So just as the British indentured servants came over in large numbers in the 17th century, in the 1600s, in the 18th century, in the 1700s, these German indentured persons came over in large numbers. Many of these people, after they had carried out their indenture, will move into these frontier areas. And these people are different religions. So now you're starting to see. So originally in the first colonies in Virginia, you had the Anglicans, right, that came as part of the Virginia Company. And then, of course, up in the Massachusetts, you had the Puritans. And then you're starting to see Presbyterians coming. You're starting to see Lutherans coming, right? So you're starting to see a whole mix of different types of Protestant sects, Protestant religions that are coming over to British North America. Methodists are another group that come. So this is a really interesting table that shows migrants to British North American colonies between 1700 and 1775, when we're right on the eve of the American Revolution. I want to point out multiple things about this table because there are so many interesting things here. The first is, notice that the majority of the migrants are coming as slaves. And so you have 278,400 slaves being brought into British North America in this 75-year period. You will also notice that the second largest group is from Ireland, and they number 108,600. Of those groups, of the Irish that were coming, none of them were slaves, but 39,000 of them were indentured servants. 17,500 were convicts, and 52,100 were free. Okay. Third largest group is the Germans, 84,500. Again, you've got a significant number of indentured servants there, no convicts, but also quite a few free. Again, England and Wales, you'll still see quite a few indentured servants coming over, quite a few convicts from England and Wales, and then even less of the free group, right? And so England is sending their indentured servants and their convicts, but they're sending much less of their free population. And then other would have just been other parts of Europe, so probably places like Scandinavia and other places like that. So you will see a total here of 585,800 migrants into British North America, the majority of which are slaves. The second highest numbers are the free people. The third highest are the indentured servants, and the fourth largest are the convicts. So let me just summarize chapter 3 a little bit here. By the mid-18th century, colonies' population has grown considerably. People are beginning to move into the frontier regions. This is a constant threat and constant pressure on Native American lands. And we are going to continue to talk about Native Americans throughout this course. This is such an important part of American history. We cannot forget that Native populations existed here in North America prior to European contact and prior to European settlement. And so we're not going to forget that this is going to be a constant strain for Native people. New colonies are developing during this time period. So the Carolinas are established in 1663. The Carolinas were established as plantation communities, so very similar to Georgia, or excuse me, to Virginia, where you had the tobacco plantations. In the Carolinas, you're going to have massive rice plantations are going to be the big staple crop there, and also indigo. And then the Carolinas will be followed by a colonial settlement in Georgia that is established later in 1732. And again, they're going to follow a very similar cultural and economic pattern as the Virginia colony. So Georgia eventually becomes a plantation society. And again, you're going to see the importation of African slaves to these colonies. So most of those slaves that you saw on that table when we're talking about over 200,000 people being brought as slaves to British North America, they are going to Virginia, to the Carolinas, and eventually to Georgia. Now, that's not that doesn't mean that there wasn't slavery in the northern colonies. There was, and there were slaves there. Okay, so I don't want you to think that there was no slavery there. There certainly was. But their need for labor and a large labor force was not as great in those northern colonies, because the plantation system is really what's driving that African slave trade. And in fact, that's what we are going to begin with in chapter 4, as we look very closely at the slave trade and how slavery develops in the South, and what events will eventually lead to the American Revolution. All right, that's it for now. Have a good one, guys.